This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. As we continue to look at Joe Biden's $1.9 trillion COVID relief package, which the House is voting to approve today, we're joined by Harvard University professor Cornel West. We last spoke to him on January 21st, the day after Biden's inauguration. We welcome you back to Democracy Now!, Professor West. I'm wondering if you can comment. This also is Biden's first 50-day mark with this landmark legislation, the significance of all of this.
Well, I think on the domestic front, it's a very positive development in terms of showing the power of government in helping working and poor people. The $15 minimum wage, though, we've got to still push through. Brother Bernie is right about that. But generally speaking, it's a positive orientation. We'll see whether it transcends the very narrow neoliberal limits that so many of us have associated Biden with, to see whether he's moving toward this more robust FDR-like legislation. So I am in some ways encouraged, similarly so with the ending of the attempt to end the support of the Saudis, sending equipment to the Saudis in the Yemen war. I was very encouraged by that. Now, when it comes to a number of other imperial policies in Africa and Latin America, in the Middle East, West Bank and in Gaza and so forth, I'm not too encouraged at all by the Biden administration, but I want to keep track of the best as well as the worst in the Biden administration.
Well, Professor West, your own employment situation has been much in the news of late. You're leaving Harvard again in a controversy. This time, Harvard was not willing to grant you tenure. One of the most famous academics and philosophers and public intellectuals in the country. Could you talk about what specifically happened this time that has made you decide to leave Harvard and go back to Union Theological Seminary?
You know, my dear brother, I'm one of these free black men that don't put up with any kind of disrespect. And there's too much Harvard dishonesty, too much Harvard hypocrisy in terms of mistreating too many black folk at high levels. And I thought he would be different this second time, but it turned out that I was wrong, and so it's time to go again. Now, I do want to acknowledge the best of Harvard, though, brother. You got Du Bois, Paul Sweezy, Helen Keller, Sister Amy Goodman, Rick Wolf. I mean, there's a rich legacy of Harvard, and I associate it with the best. But the worst, of course, is Harvard's commodified state, tied to big money, tied to image, tied to reputation. And in the end, just being of service to the empire and being of service to the ruling classes. So you got the best and the worst of Harvard at work. And it's time for me to go back to the great Union Theological Seminary. That's my institutional home, my brother. I can stretch out and try to be a truth-teller and bear witness, still learn and listen, but also be in the middle of the Big Apple. Nothing like it.
You've suggested that, Professor West, that you believe some of the reasons that you were denied tenure were your support for Palestinian rights as well as for Senator Bernie Sanders. Can you elaborate on both?
Well, I argued to myself, it could either be age, what I'm giving the Gifford lectures, kind of Nobel Prize version of philosophical lectures. So someone in Scotland feels that I still have something to say. So it couldn't be age. It couldn't be academics because I'd published 20-some books. I was a university professor at Harvard, university professor at Princeton. I got tenure at Yale 37 years ago. So it's a joke. It's just ludicrous and ridiculous that they would be so hesitant to allow for a tenure process to go forth. So I figured it had to be political. And the most taboo issue on U.S. campuses these days in many instances has to do with the vicious Israeli occupation of precious Palestinians. It's very difficult to have a respectful, robust conversation about that. And I am unequivocal in my solidarity with Palestinian brothers and sisters. And as you've heard me say on many times, if there's a Palestinian occupation of Jews, then I'm unequivocally in solidarity with Jews. I hate injustice. I hate occupation. I'm not in any way going to stop talking about the Palestinian plight and predicament. There was a brilliant Jewish Israeli scholar who was denied a tenure position at Harvard just 2 years ago, and most believe it was political. Most believe it was political. Sister Lorgia Pena Garcia was just denied, and I think that was in part political. So people argue, well, you're just grabbing for straws. No. I detect a pattern at Harvard in terms of not being open to voices that are fundamentally committed to the dealing with the plight and predicament of precious Palestinians. And
speaking of that pattern, you were quoted Cornel, you were quoted in Truth Out as saying if you subtract the number of black people in the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard and only include black folks in the other departments, Harvard looks like the National Hockey League. Could you explain?
That's true. That's true. Well, a few ink spots against the backdrop of whiteness, just like Silicon Valley and just like Wall Street. All of these professional managerial sites at the highest level of the empire still are very much lily white. Now, what you have is, at Harvard, you have a significant number of black folk at the highest level of administration, of deans, but it hasn't translated into increase of faculty, and it hasn't translated, most importantly, in terms of making sure that the students seeking truth and concerned about issues of justice are able to gain access to professors who are raising these kinds of issues. This has to do with the ethnic studies program, it has to do with courses in history, the great Walter Johnson and the others trying to provide some frameworks in order to come to terms with these injustices, be it predatory capitalism or be it white supremacy or male supremacy or imperialism around the world or whatever. Those issues are very difficult to get at the center of a discourse. And this is true not just at Harvard, but at other places as well. But I think it's especially Harvard. I mean, Harvard now, I think, suffers from a kind of self-idolatry that it needs to be critical of itself in order to grow. And again, if it can be in contact with the best of its past, then it's got a chance. But if it just remains well-adjusted to the status quo, generating careers and opportunist students rather than critically oriented students who have a heart and soul concerned about suffering here and around the world, then Harvard has a chance. So I'm not giving up on Harvard, but I am making my way to New York. I only got one life to live, and I don't have time for Harvard pettiness. No doubt about that. No.
You have a lot of people coming out in your support. I wanted to talk about the noted UCLA professor, Robin Kelley, who wrote the piece, Why Cornel West's Tenure Fight Matters. And he says, Harvard has a problem with outspoken, principled faculty who take public positions that question university policy, challenge authority, or might ruffle the feathers of big donors. And when the faculty in question are scholars of color, their odds of getting through the tenure process are slim to none. He particularly references Garcia Pena, one of the first of Harvard's appointments to specialize in ethnic studies, who was denied tenure in 2019. Can you talk about the significance of this? And of course, you have the Black Student Law. The Harvard Black Law Student Association writing to the administration, Harvard's refusal to consider Dr. West for tenure continues a consistent pattern of practice that undermines and devalues the scholarship of black professors and professors of color. In 1992, Derek Bell, the preeminent scholar on critical race theory and the first black man to receive tenure at Harvard Law School, left HLS in protest of its refusal to hire a black woman and the lack of diversity within the faculty. For 7 years, the university denied the Latino Law Review the right to use the Harvard name. In 2019, the university refused to grant tenure to Professor Lorgia Garcia Pena, a decision that undermined cross-organizational efforts on campus for an ethnic studies program. The refusal to consider Dr. West for tenure raises concerns about the future treatment of black academics and academics of color in a tenure process that already lacks transparency. A lot there, Professor West, but your response.
Oh, but my dear brother Robin D.G. Kelley, though, he's one of the great intellectuals in American life. He was one of the greatest tributes that I've ever received, really. Because what he did, as you know, he published his letter that he wrote to the committee. So he went beyond the confidentiality of it. It took tremendous courage to do that, he said, and let the world know what he said. And when you're reading from that particular letter, so I mean, this brother, he loves me in a deep way, but I've had unbelievable support across the board from the Harvard students, Harvard faculty, oh my God, my dear brother Ron Sullivan, Stephanie Robinson, and David Carrasco and Walter Johnson. I mean, I've had unbelievable support across the board, and it's a beautiful thing, but it can't be focused on me. We've got to open the doors to the younger generation. That's the key. And when they get in there, they shouldn't sell their souls, but when they get in there, they ought to be truth tellers. When they get in there, they ought to be seekers of conditions under which poor and working people can live lives of decency and dignity. That is the key. So in a way now, we've got to shift away from me and really focus on keeping the pressure on the Harvard administration. And this is true for colleges and universities across the board. Because everywhere you go in a university, black folk being disrespected, black folk being devalued, black folk being overworked, black folk being undercut and so forth, undermined. And it's ridiculous, really. It really is. And when I think about where I am now in my own calling and my own vocation, it's just downright pathetic that I even have to worry about this mess. You know what I mean?
Well, Cornel, I wanted to ask you, in terms of this issue of the systemic problem that this and other attacks on the African-American community represent, we had a huge high tide of mass protest across the nation. There were commitments by local governments, police departments, foundations. Everyone said after the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, things are going to change. But now we're in the winter of discontent here, and all of a sudden, all that fire of the summer and the early fall has gone out of the movement. Talk about what's happening right now in terms of the country addressing these systemic problems.
No, my dear brother Juan, that's a wonderful question. Oh, man, you begin to see just how superficial the rhetoric actually is. Very little execution, very little follow through. You have a Black Lives Matter for a moment, for a while, where people are in the streets. Corporate America, University America acts as if it's going to undergo this fundamental transformation and change. They bring in a few black folk at the top. Next thing you know, we right back to business as usual, routinizing all of the built-in forms of holding black folk at arm's length. And this is especially so when it comes to our precious black poor and working class folk who hardly ever get in on any of their benefits. Usually it's a co-optation of black folk at the top. And so that's why we have to keep the pressure. But we can't in any way be seduced by the superficial rhetoric. We have to make sure that there's content. We have to make sure that there's substance in terms of following through and with high quality figures gaining assets to positions of power and being able to try to push this quest for veritas, this quest for truth. And the condition of all truth for human beings is to allow suffering to speak. I don't care whose suffering it is, Africa, Latin America, Middle East, Roxbury, Harlem, poor white brothers in Appalachia, Dalits, Roma in Europe, Muslims in China. We have to have that kind of universal embrace, even as we function within these universities. These universities are just context, but our calling cuts much deeper, and that's why Union Theological Seminary means so much to me, because in that context, I can be the full free black man, the Jesus-loving free black man, fundamentally committed to focusing on the oppressed around the world.
Finally, wasn't it you, Professor West, that told the story of President Obama being next to him at some event and him saying, please, give me a break, lay off a little bit? So that was during the Obama-Biden years. Now this is the Biden-Harris years. And I'm wondering where you feel the most pressure needs to be brought as you see it shaping up, as we talk today in the midst of the Derek Chauvin jury selection, the passage of the George Floyd Police Accountability Act? Your thoughts?
I think the two major issues we've got to zero in on are poverty and the empowerment of workers, especially empowerment of the trade union movement, and militarism around the world, in all various parts of the world. And that militarism also is connected to that $3.8 billion that goes to the state of Israel that still subordinates too many of precious Palestinian brothers and sisters. Their suffering rendered invisible. And I'm very worried about the Secretary of State and Biden and the words that I hear in that regard. But those two fronts, it seems to me, Sister Amy, the militarism abroad and the poverty, hitting poverty head on. This is why the uplifting of precious children of all colors out of poverty is a very positive thing. But we've got to empower their parents, workers, trade union movement. We got to hit those head on. Now, of course, we got police brutality, you got vicious white supremacy too, but that's kind of a given. We've been talking about that as well. But for me, they all go hand in hand, those three. White supremacy, the predatory capitalism, and the empowerment of poor and working people, especially tied to the best of the trade union movement, and the militarism around the world, the imperial militarism of the United States around the world.